Science shouldn't have to rely on government grants. Science shouldn't have to rely on which political party's in power. Science shouldn't have to rely on a political agenda, on political views. Science should be funded by people who believe in science, who love science, who think science is beneficial. It should be funded voluntarily by all of us. I would send a check in to a science foundation if the government got out of it. Universities would fund science instead of building beautiful dorms, instead of paying administrators and hiring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of additional administrative. They could use all that tuition money that they've got over the last few decades and fund more science. Corporations would fund science. Businesses would fund science, as they used to do before the government basically monopolized the funding of science. It took it all over. Pharmaceutical companies would fund a lot of basic science because there's a profit motive there. That's the way you get to drugs. So I don't worry about the funding of science. What I'd like to see is the government shrink the funding of science to as close to zero as possible, but at the same time, lower taxes to as low as possible and free up capital and reduce the corporate income tax rate to zero, thus encouraging corporations to invest money. So they could do things, the government could do things to free us up. Now, in the meantime, I do wonder whether cuts to science in and of itself is the first thing that should be cut. There's so many stupid things the government does. There's so many wasteful, completely useless things the government does. And that they should be cut first. I mean, starting with government involvement in healthcare and government involvement with our retirement, and government involvement with our savings, the government involvement in business and in regulations and all that. All of that should be scrapped. And at the same time, we should scrap the funding of science and move to a private funding of science model where the science has to stand on its own 2 feet. It has to prove itself to somebody objective, not to politicians, not to bureaucrats, not to scientists motivated by politics, not a scientist motivated by pleasing the political class, but to people really who love science, who care about science, who want science. Those are the people who would be funding the science, and therefore we would get real science rather than the political stuff we get today. Now, I'm not saying all science today is political, but there's too much of it, and it's important. Science is way, like education, way too important to leave to the government. I want a government that only does one thing: protects my rights, a military, a police force, a judiciary system that arbitrates disputes, and otherwise leaves us alone. What I want is pure capitalism. You're listening to the Yaron Brook Show, the only place on the planet where you'll hear these views, the views of reason and rationality and science.